The Fancounters Celebrity Podcast, number 158. Coming to you from nowhere near the entertainment capital of the world, this is the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast.
You were like the carrot top of interviewers.
Wow, how disappointing was that question?
You did not just ask me that.
Well, that's a big question.
Never mind, I'm done. I'm not doing the show.
Wow, I can't believe it.
I'm telling you, I'm hooked.
Nick.
Yeah, he's so awesome. He's a good friend of mine.
Welcome to Fancounters. My name's Nick. Thank you so much for joining me. You can find us on social media. If you go to @Fancounters Live on Instagram, we also have a Facebook group. If you search Fancounters, you will find us there. Now, this is a very special weekend because somebody that we've kind of honored throughout the whole podcast is turning 45. Well, she would have turned 45. We are talking about the late Heather O'Rourke. And this week on the podcast, we are going to honor Heather, telling her story the way that we believe that it should be told and giving some memories that we feel that maybe fans forgot about. So we want to get into all of that today. And with me for a very special podcast this week is one of my good friends, Brian Pocrass. Brian, you were a former guest. Welcome to this episode of Fancounters.
Thanks, I'm happy to be here.
Now, you have a lot of Hollywood insight, which is why I asked you to be a part of this show. We have been going back and forth. Of course, we have discussed in great length something that I get a lot of emails about, and that is the Heather O'Rourke documentary film that we have been talking a lot about called She Was Here. And now we're not going to go into that at all this week, but because you and I have partnered on that film, I want to get some of your thoughts and memories as we kind of go through her career.
Yeah, well, Heather O'Rourke has always been someone who's been close to my heart because of the fact that she was my childhood crush. And I think that was a real traumatic experience for me personally when that was the first time I had ever dealt with death. And of course, everyone has their childhood crush, and it was really hard for me when all of a sudden mine passes away. And I think that Heather, I've always thought of her as a childhood friend, and this is really an honor to be able to pay some tribute to her and really set the record straight a lot of the rumors that have come out about her, and really just giving the most accurate information out there. And I'm happy to be here with you.
Well, thank you. And you're right. I think Heather's passing was the first for many of us because she died so young. You know, you're my same age. I was her same age. So it kind of hit us all hard at the same time. And as we're going to find out in the podcast today, we're going to talk to some of her co-stars, not live, but we've talked to them in the past. And we're going to play some memories that they have of Heather. And surprisingly, you'll find out that somebody that's your friend, Brian, if you hadn't heard in the original interview, also experienced her death to be the first one that she encountered. And we'll get into all that in a little bit. So you're going to hear from Heather's co-stars. And we've also got some archived clips of Heather talking about her career as well. So it's going to be a very special hour, and really glad you guys joined us. So
yeah, definitely. Well, the great thing is that to really give Heather a voice, because I think it's really exciting for us as the two of us are going on this journey to understand what kind of a person she was. And we're kind of learning bits and pieces, and a lot of them are consistent, which is nice. It's kind of, I think we're really getting a good sense of who Heather was as a person.
You know, and I don't want, and this is what, you know, Tammy and I went back and forth talking about this film. I just said the main reason we need to do this project is because the speculation of how she died has really started to overshadow her life's work. And for somebody who is just 12 years old, she accomplished more than many actors even today. We don't want that to happen.
Yeah, I feel like we have a duty to do this.
So let's start with her early life. In 1975, it was spring, and Kathleen and Michael O'Rourke found out that they were expecting their second child. In fact, Kathleen had become ill, so she was rushed to the hospital to find out that she had a miscarriage. 3-year-old Tammy, her sister, could not understand why she wasn't going to be having a sibling. And the month after, Kathleen said she still felt pregnant. It was a very weird thing. So what did she do? She returned to the doctor and found out that she was still pregnant because Kathleen was pregnant with twins, a boy and a girl. And although they lost the boy to the miscarriage, the girl survived. And her name is Heather Michelle O'Rourke. And she was born December 27th, 1975 in San Diego, some 45 years ago.
Can you imagine like being pregnant with twins or just thinking you've miscarried and then all of a sudden having a baby still there? That must have just have been amazing.
I can relate a lot because, well, I had twins. My wife did, but now they're 8 years old. But just the thrill of knowing that you're pregnant and then finding out you're having two, but Kathleen didn't get to feel that. She was pregnant, didn't get to feel the joy of, hey, you're having twins until she had already lost one. And I can't imagine how traumatic that had to have been.
Yeah, well, Heather, I guess, was a miracle baby. I mean, you'd think you're not pregnant at all, and now all of a sudden, oh, by the way, you're pregnant.
Yeah, and you'd think, wow, she is really a miracle that she survived and she was born and healthy and all of that. It would have been awesome to say, with the trajectory of her life, had she gone on to become an adult, how many more things she would accomplish would have just been spectacular. So Michael was a carpenter by trade, and Kathleen worked part-time. While she was working part-time, she put Tammy in some dance classes at 3 years old. The dance teacher took Kathleen aside to convince her that Tammy was actually good enough for her talent to be developed. And that developed into things like beauty pageants, but also films. In fact, Kathleen and Tammy often started making some regular trips to Los Angeles. Heather would often come with them because, she was the stay-at-home mom. And they got an agent to represent Tammy, which I think back then in the late 70s was a lot easier of a chore than it is today.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. Well, I think it's just if you have a kid who's talented and has that charismatic personality and that big smile, they're going to work. And Tammy definitely had that.
She competed against 350 kids to be a kids dance troupe on CBS's The Tim Conway Show. Tammy made the cut out of 350 kids. They only picked 5 boys and 5 girls, and she did it. She also appeared in MGM's Pennies from Heaven, and this moment of her being in that film would change her sister's life forever.
Yeah, no, I love the story that you're about to tell here about Heather, because this is one of those famous Hollywood stories, and this one is actually true. Yeah, the greatest thing about Heather's story, it's one of those Hollywood lore stories, kind of like Lana Turner or Marilyn Monroe being discovered at the soda shop or Natalie Portman being discovered at the pizza parlor. And usually those stories have about 10% truth to it. Like, I think the Natalie Portman was like, yeah, she was discovered in a pizza parlor, but she was already acting and modeling at that time. But with Heather, it is one of those stories, and it is 100% true.
All right, this is Kathleen in an interview from around, I would think 1982-ish, talking about that moment that Heather was discovered.
Heather was kind of a perfectionist. She was kind of quiet, but yet she'd have this kind of sense of humor that all of a sudden came out of the blue. Her sister was doing Pennies from Heaven at MGM, and Heather was there with me. And we went to lunch, and Steven Spielberg approached her and said, would you like to do a movie? And she said, I don't know. And he said, well, how old are you? She said, I'm 5. And he said, well, you need to be 6. She said, fine. She just wanted to eat her sandwich. She said, well, okay, I'll interview you. She said, fine. We went into the interview, and Steven had these stuffed animals. And it was a pink pig and a purple fish or something. Said she had to be frightened. Well, she laughed and laughed and giggled. And he told her the next day, he said, well, you're too young. She said, fine. We didn't know who Steven was, and then he said there was something about her, so he asked her to come back again, and we brought a script from Sesame Street about the Cookie Monster. And well, I didn't think I'd have to go in there with her, but I had to go in there with her and do the script with her. And then Steven said, well, that was good, Heather. He said, can you cry? And she said, yeah. He said, can you scream? She kept screaming and screaming. She finally said, I really can't do anymore. And he said, fine. He said, you can go now. And the next day he told him the commissary she had the job.
That's pretty amazing. Wasn't it fact, Brian, that Drew Barrymore was considered for that role as well?
Yeah, Drew read for Poltergeist. See, 1982 was just kind of a strange year for Steven because at that time he was doing Poltergeist and E.T. And I think there's been a lot of, not really controversy, but I guess, what really happened here is I guess at the time the DGA only allowed you to direct one film per year. And so Steven couldn't be a director on both projects. So he got a directing credit on E.T. and Poltergeist is directed by Toby Hopper. But people say that Steven really directed that film. And so, for this one, he was really working on both of these films, and he auditioned Drew Barrymore first for this Poltergeist role because he just was looking for this particular girl. He had this thought in his mind of what he wanted, and Drew was not exactly what he wanted for that role, and it went to Heather. And the thing that's great about that story that you just played right there, it's just, I can just imagine here you have Stephen in the commissary at MGM upset because he can't find his Carol Ann. He knows exactly what he wants. And he looks over and sees Heather sitting there with her mom. She's sitting there eating her BLT sandwich. and he just walks over to her and just kind of says like, hey, are you an actress? And I think at the time she wasn't, or it was really Tammy that was acting.
Yeah, Heather had actually appeared in a couple commercials. One was for Barbie, for Mattel. She was also in a commercial for McDonald's and Long John Silver's. So she had at least 3 commercial credits by that time.
Oh, and she also, guest starred on Fantasy Island. But before, she really wasn't acting as much as Tammy was, but I guess she just, because you can imagine, Heather just had that amazing look to her because she was about 5.5 years old at this time, but she looked like she was about 2 or 3. And that was kind of what concerned Stephen a little bit because he was looking for a girl who was about 5 or 6, but Heather looks about 3, but had the maturity of a 7-year-old. She could read at that time. So It was really an amazing pick for him, but his concern was that she was too young. And I guess as Kathy said, she went in and she read, and she just didn't really nail it. And so he excused her, and he read a few more girls, and then he was thinking, man, that Heather was exactly what I wanted. Let's see if we can bring her back in, and I can give her a read and see if we can maybe mold her into what I wanted. And she gave her reading on second audition, and she nailed it. And the rest is, I guess, as we say, history.
Yeah, and the story goes is that Stephen made her scream and scream so much, she finally turned to him and says, "Can I be done? I'm done screaming now. I'm going to go." And she cut that interview short and still got the part, which is pretty funny.
Yeah, of course, and we're going to get into that later, at least when it comes to her personality. I mean, we're seeing that Heather, as well as all the O'Rourke women, are straight shooters. Like, they are not ones to stay quiet. They speak their mind, and they're very respectful and very strong. And I think we saw that in a 5.5-year-old Heather O'Rourke who's telling Stephen, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. Now, let's play a clip from Heather. I've got one where she talks about how well she reads and memorizes.
I learned how to read before kindergarten, so I knew how to read, and I read real well, and I memorized scripts really quick.
Yeah, that was the key to her success, is the fact that she could go through a script and have it all ready to go in a very short amount of time. A talent that not only happened when she was really young, but we're going to hear later on how in her later projects she would be cast the night before and get on set and do a perfect job the day after.
Yeah, well, the thing about Heather that was so great is the fact that she was able to read, as you were saying, when she was so young, and read and memorize so well. And the fact that you have someone who looks a couple years younger than she is and has the smarts and maturity of someone a year or two older, that will equal a booking machine. And that's exactly what Heather was. It was pretty much off to the races right after Poltergeist.
Now, speaking of Poltergeist, she was asked in the same interview if she was excited to be in the movie, and this is what she had to say.
I was excited because that was my first movie I ever did.
Her performance in Poltergeist, if you really sat there and watched it, she didn't have many lines, and she also didn't get an incredible amount of screen time because, she was sucked in through the television and didn't really have a lot of screen time after she was sucked in there. But you remembered her. There was something so memorable about the way she delivered her lines, her facial expressions, and I'm sure, as we've seen, a lot of magazines have really called that one performance one of the greatest child acting performances of all time. It's been marked that there's something about that performance.
Well,
and certainly the line "they're here" is one of the top 100 film lines ever, which is pretty amazing for her first movie. One of those scary scenes that we remember Heather for is when the bedroom was being sucked into the closet. Everything in the room was moving, and they, obviously the beds and stuff that the kids were sleeping in were moving. And there was a very unnatural movement of the bedroom that startled Heather. And she was in a harness to make sure that she wasn't hurt. Air was blowing in her face and ears for long periods of time. And what's amazing is this 5-year-old endured this for a few hours. And she was hanging high in the air, and Heather began to cry. And so Steven Spielberg yelled, "Cut." He recognizes that she was afraid, and he goes to her and comforts her, kind of like a father would do to a child. He was really concerned with her well-being, and he said to her, "You don't have to perform this scene again." And in order to finish that, they actually brought in a stunt double, but it just kind of goes to show how much these directors cared for these kids on set, especially when they're making a movie with a lot of practical effects that they're doing, you know, because back in 1982, we didn't have the CGI. We were doing everything in camera, which required a lot more from the actors, I think.
Yeah, well, Steven Spielberg has always been one to really take extra special care of his kids on set, and he just understands that, you know, they always say the hardest people to direct are kids and animals. And, you know, the thing with Steven is he's always been so good at relating to the children and understanding them and making sure that they're comfortable, making sure they're not acting in any of an unsafe environment, and just kind of making sure that that's how you get the best performance, is if they're comfortable, they're going to give it all. And I think he really took care of Heather and took care of, I mean, every child on every set that he's ever worked with has always said amazing things about him.
Her co-star in that movie was another child named Oliver Robbins. Oliver played the brother in the movie, and he appeared on the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast, and he shared a little bit about his memories of working with Heather in Poltergeist.
Well, you know, I remember just having a great relationship with her on the set of Poltergeist, and we used to ride bikes around all the time together. And I think people have to understand this is long before the internet, before you had handheld video games, before kids could do a lot of different things and sit and play on their iPad.
Right.
There really wasn't that much to do. So we used to have like adventures, you know, riding our bikes around the lot at MGM. It was very, you know, it was kind of poetic and magical and things like that. And we were sharing part of our childhood together, you know, at MGM. And we used to go to lunch together, all of us, my mom, you know, Heather's mom, Tammy, and we were all just like one big family. So it just wasn't, you know, just like one experience, I would say. It was just the whole collective moment in our lives, and that I got to share with her. And I think, you know, if she'd lived, she would have gone on to do a lot of different things. She was precocious and so smart, and she had her own ideas, and she even talked about becoming a filmmaker herself. So, you know, it's such a tragedy because we lost someone that was beautiful and smart, and I think the world kind of missed out because we never got to see what she would have done.
The great thing that I love when I talk to people about Heather, it's surprising to me that after all this time, people's memories of Heather are so strong, and they all kind of follow the same line. Everyone says that she was very serious, she was precocious, she was friendly, and just a very smart girl. And that's just the thing that always kind of gets to me when it comes to memories, that why it's so great when we talk to different people and they seem to remember her. And they have pretty strong, vivid memories. Also, one fun thing about Poltergeist, and it kind of follows suit with how Heather was on all of her sets, is, you know, she was a strict professional, even at 5.5. And I've even read a couple stories where there were times when she was acting and she got really scared during one of those scenes and she wet the bed. Now, of course, you know, 5.5, wetting the bed. And she did not tell anybody about that until they called cut. I mean, just for someone who's 5.5, it's like she did not want to mess up the scene or mess up the shot. And this wasn't because of anything. It's not like anyone would get mad at her. It was more of this internal thing where Heather knew the importance of what she was doing, and she wasn't going to get a little thing like wetting the bed ruin her performance.
That's unbelievable to me, only because with 8-year-olds, any little thing that happens, especially if they get a minor like paper cut and it bleeds, they're screaming like they're dying. So for a 5-year-old to have something like that happen, that's embarrassing, but also the ability to just deal with it and wait till the end is amazing.
They say that how you are sometimes as a kid is how you are as a person. I know a lot of times we sit here and think, oh, well, you're a completely different person than when you're 5 or when you're 10 or when you're 15 than what you are now. But a lot of the traits and what you are inside remains. And the thing is, at 5.5, she was serious. She got it. She wanted to make sure everyone was happy. She wanted to make sure she did a great performance. And that's just something that was in her, part of her psyche. The other thing I wanted to mention about Drew Barrymore is I always felt like Drew had a little bit of an edge to her when she talked about Poltergeist, because she did that quite a bit. If you kind of hear in those old interviews when she's talking about E.T., when they ask how she got the part, and she always mentions Poltergeist and how she didn't get that role. And it's like, you know, even as a little kid, you know, she's just as competitive as Heather is. And I think, you know, Drew always kind of was upset with herself that she couldn't nail that Carol Ann role.
How did you get the part? Didn't you have to go in and test for this?
Well, first he interviewed me for Poltergeist.
Poltergeist. Mm-hmm.
And actually, I didn't want to do that movie because it was kind of scary.
It's too scary.
And probably if I went in and I said, "Excuse me, but it's my film," he'll probably say, "Isn't it too scary for you to be in?"
Yeah.
So he interviewed me and he said, "Oh, well, she has too much personality." So he said, "We're going to interview. I'm going to make a movie and it's going to be E.T. the Extraterrestrial."
I just think that it's just interesting how she keeps bringing it up, and I've heard about in 4 or 5 interviews how she was up for Poltergeist and didn't get that role. And it's kind of like, I think it bothered her a little bit. And I think it just kind of always stuck with her and, just kind of maybe helped drive her competitive edge. But, Heather beat out Drew.
Don't you think, though, that was sort of in favor of Drew, knowing what her career turned out to be? Had she been a scream queen, her whole entire acting roles might have gone in a completely different direction, other than all these kind of sappy love stories that she is in and has been in for her whole life.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. I think things were meant to be what they were meant to be. And even Steven knew it. I mean, she was perfect as Gertie in E.T. And I think that she probably wouldn't have been as strong as Heather was in Poltergeist. It's kind of like, it's hard to imagine either of them in any other role than those ones right there. And I think that, it all worked out for the better. But I'm just saying, just internally for Drew, I think there was always kind of like that, like, damn, Heather, I wanted that role.
Yeah. Now, after Poltergeist came a Disney special called Believe You Can and You Can. And I think, was that Maury Amsterdam who hosted that?
Yeah, it's really cool because this particular project is what I knew Heather from. This was my first introduction to Heather as a kid because I was a big Disneyland fanatic as a kid, and I'm sure as most people are. And it was a pretty big thing going on in Disneyland because they were closing Fantasyland. And I guess the park had been open for a little less than 30 years. And it was a huge deal because they closed Fantasyland for over a year to do a major revamp. And then so pretty much it opened, I think, in March of 1983. And so what Disney tried to do is they created this 1 hour, kind of like an infomercial, basically letting people know what the new Fantasyland is going to have. Mm-hmm. And so they created this 1 hour special and tried to make some little storyline around it, which is just really funny because if you ever take a look at it, it's on YouTube. And I watched it recently just to kind of refresh my memory. And it's just so wrong. Like the story they put together, just like with the whole basic story was that like this family was moving and Heather was the daughter and she was really bummed because she wasn't going to get to see the new Fantasyland and she was going to have no friends because like the father got like a job somewhere else. And so the older brother comes in there and is like, "Hey, Heather, like I'm going to go say goodbye to my girlfriend who works at Disneyland. Want to come and say goodbye to your friends?" And Heather's like, "Sure." And then the next shot has them walking down Main Street. And then all of a sudden the brother says to Heather, "Okay, Heather, I'm going to go say goodbye to my girlfriend. I'll see you in a few hours." And he just kind of leaves her there by herself at Disneyland. And she's got like this Mickey Mouse stuffed animal she's talking to. And then kind of some older man comes over there, is played by Maury Amsterdam, who's like this magical creature. And he's like, "Oh, I see you're upset. Like, do you want to come back with me and I'll show you the new Fantasyland?" And she's like, "Sure." It gets even crazier because then like as the storyline goes on, she's really bummed because she's upset she's moving and they're kind of like sad shaming her, like making her like feel bad like because she's upset, understandably. And they're kind of like, "You have to believe, Heather. You have to believe." And they kind of put her on some like trial with all these villains from the Disney like all the Queen and the Wicked Witch and just making her feel horrible until she finally says she believes. And I'm just thinking, like, watching it now, it's like, come on, this girl is moving and you're like getting angry at her for leaving. But meanwhile, they kind of show all the new things in Fantasyland and all the cool things. And then it has some tacked on happy ending where the mother runs to Disneyland is like, "Oh, guess what? The dad is not leaving anymore and we get to stay." And she's all like, "See, it's all because I believed I can and I can."
Wow.
And it's just,
I remember that show, but I don't remember the story in great depth like that. And now that you like put it out there.
Yeah, it was just, I mean, obviously it's only because I rewatched it with, 2020 eyes, but
Yeah.
it's just you're watching, you're like, my goodness. I mean, this is like what they kind of put on there. And it was just basically to do a big promo for this new Fantasyland. They actually called it New Fantasyland. And then about a month later, after the special aired, they had a big ceremony and Heather was there, and she was one of the first people to walk across the new the drawbridge that had been closed for a year. And I think, as we've been hearing, is this was a real special project for Heather personally, because I believe they lived about a couple blocks from Disneyland.
They did.
So, yeah, so at this time as well. So, I mean, just imagine, being about 7 years old and getting to go to Disneyland and film at Disneyland and get to see this brand new Fantasyland before anybody else. I mean, that must have been just an incredible thrill.
Well, after that special aired, we're about the time of the fall of 1982, and Heather continues to work. She continues to make television shows. She appears on shows like Maserati and the Brain, which is a movie. She was on Chips and Webster. She was also in an episode of Our House, which was a Wilford Brimley production. But a role that does find her some great success is a well-known show heading into its 10th season called Happy Days. And here, Brian, I've got a treat for us, because Brian Levant is the producer and director of the episode in which Heather first appears in Happy Days, and he's here to tell us about how that came to be.
She was on Happy Days.
Yes.
Of course, she came to fame as a little girl in Poltergeist.
Yep.
The 10th season of Happy Days, when I returned from Ork to Milwaukee, we were faced with a series that no longer had Aaron Moran and Scott Baio as regulars. They were off doing their ill-conceived, gratefully short-lived spin-off, and Fonzie had lost Richie and Ralph, and and so in an effort to find a new center for the show and to have it continue to grow and mature, we decided that Fonzie should have a regular girlfriend, that it should be the estranged daughter of the Fisters of Milwaukee, the owners of things like the Pfister Hotel, and that she would have a daughter. And we cast Heather. We did look at a lot of other people before we cast her. Henry sat down and worked with her, played with her, talked with her for about 3.5 hours, and said, book her. And we did, and she was a delight, and the audiences loved her, and it brought out a very sensitive, sweet side of Fonzie. And that was good for us, but having a regular girlfriend wasn't especially good for the series. And the next year, they moved on. But we loved having, and that's how I knew the family, of course, and we loved having her. She was great. Instead of playing sweet, for her to play mean.
Yep, she was kind of nasty.
It was. It's hard to say what was a sadder funeral, that or Phil Hartman, but there weren't any in the league with those two. Oh my God, those were just crushing. To lose a little girl to sepsis. I don't think she was 10, to tell you the truth.
Well, she was 12, but that's okay, Brian. But she did appear on Happy Days, and it's funny that he mentioned that she played a nasty character, because it would not be the last time she would play kind of the mean role.
Yeah, well, the funny thing about Happy Days, when you look at it at the time when she was cast, I mean, it's kind of crazy that Happy Days went as long as it did, because it clearly, when Ron Howard left the show, Ron Howard and Donnie Most both left, and then Henry Winkler, the Fonz, became the center. And I think they left like in season 8. And so then season 9 was just the Fonz. And then, as Brian was talking about, they brought on Heather and Linda Pearl to play his girlfriend and the girlfriend's daughter. And then she was on for about 12 episodes and was hilarious. And this was obviously a big role. But I mean, the show had kind of jumped the shark already. I mean, I guess that term actually comes from Happy Days, jumping the shark.
I don't know if you're
familiar with that phrase.
Yes.
It's like it basically means a show is kind of lost its magic and kind of is going on a little too long. And so anyways, and then when they they replaced, or not replaced, but they kind of figured, as Brian was saying, that having a girlfriend for Fonzie wasn't the best thing. So they decided to go on for one more season, but Heather and Linda were gone at this point.
This does find us now at 1984. Tammy has stopped acting at age 12. She decides that that's not for her anymore, which was funny because 2 years earlier in that interview that we played a couple clips from Heather, Tammy had said that she also wanted an acting career and wanted to be on Broadway, and that was kind of her dream. I do wonder, and I didn't get a chance to ask her this when I spoke with her on the show in like episode 68 or something, why she actually turned away from and just stopped, whether it was Heather overshadowing her own success and that kind of thing. But 1984 is also the time when Kathleen met Jim Peel, who lived in the same mobile home park as them, and he was a part-time truck driver. They ended up getting married and moving to Big Bear, and they bought a house there. And then after that, she appears on the Jerry Lewis MDA telethon. She was taking phone pledges with other child actors. She was a celebrity judge on a show called Putting on the Hits. She also guested on shows like the Merv Griffin Show. And this was all between Poltergeist 1 and 2, because then this leads right into her doing Poltergeist 2.
Yeah, well, after Poltergeist 1, as I was saying, it was really off to the races for Heather. I mean, we've always talked about, it's just interesting how child acting careers happen, because when you get hot as a child, it's literally booking after booking after booking, because they know that, these kids are going to be getting a little older, and you want to kind of get them when they look a certain age. And the thing with Heather is she always looked a lot younger than she was, and she was such a great little performer. And so she was just a major fixture on television after 1982. It was just kind of like she really went from one project to another, whether it was commercials or guest starring on TV shows. And then it wasn't until they decided to greenlight a second Poltergeist till we saw Heather return on the big screen. Hey, by the way, have you ever seen the 1985 TV movie Surviving?
I don't think I've ever heard of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually hadn't heard of it either, but then I saw it on YouTube because I always kind of saw that on Heather's credits, and I decided I'd give it a watch. And it was this TV movie, and what makes it interesting was that it was a pretty dark movie. I mean, it's one of those ones that's about suicide, where you kind of had a couple that was in high school, and it was played by Molly Ringwald and the actor who was in Gremlins. And Molly Ringwald played kind of this dark character who was troubled, and she had been institutionalized for I think trying to kill herself, and she came back in, and all of a sudden she started dating the guy from Gremlins, the actor, and he had two younger siblings, and they were played by River Phoenix and Heather. Wow. And it's actually a pretty disturbing story, because the two of them end up taking their own lives, and then they have like a scene where they get discovered, like I think they did it in the garage, like with the carbon monoxide, and it's really kind of, the whole point of it is it's trying to kind of show the aftermath of when something like that happens. Wow. And how it really affects the family, and trying to encourage people to get help. But, the fact that the younger siblings were played by River Phoenix and Heather O'Rourke, who are two actors who didn't live into adulthood, is just ironic in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And also, as we've seen a lot of things with Heather in her personal life, I think she had a bit of a crush on River Phoenix. Like, there's been a lot of little doodlings that we've seen in some of her personal items that Kathy has shared with us, that she writes River Phoenix, and River Phoenix with a heart, and I think certain things, questionnaires she's filled out. Who's your favorite actor? River Phoenix. And who would you like to see more in magazines? And she's like, River Phoenix. So it's just kind of a cute little thing that they obviously, got a little close on set, and it was just kind of a cute thing to see.
Wow, that's a neat story. I'm glad you brought that up. In 1985, they did start filming Poltergeist 2, and they hired an Englishman director named Brian Gibson to do the film. And when Poltergeist 2 started, Heather had 3 years now of primetime television to her credit. We've talked about a few of those shows. And she was 9 years old, so she obviously gained a lot more experience, a lot more ability with her acting. I'm sure that she had been getting lessons and been coached throughout that time to make her have the strong performance that she did in Poltergeist 2. But that film is what kind of started the whole rumor of the Poltergeist curse There was a lot of delays and some strange occurrences that happened with that film. Of course, we did lose Dominique Dunne from the first movie, but what happened on that set was Heather getting an itch to direct. She wanted to follow in the footsteps of people that she admired, like Michael Landon and Sylvester Stallone. And that's when I think that drive for her to create really took off.
Yeah, and it's funny with Poltergeist 2. I mean, I saw that movie quite a bit, and as a kid, I didn't see Poltergeist 1, but 2 I saw quite a bit, and she had a pretty substantial role in this film. And I know she's been noted saying that Poltergeist 2 wasn't very scary, and she thought it was kind of dumb, and she didn't like watching it. But I don't know about you, but that movie scared the heck out of me as a kid. There were like a couple scenes in there that I, even to this day, get those kind of weird feelings in my stomach when I see them.
Well, the main reason for that scaring you so much is because of Julian Beck, who was an actor for a long time who was battling cancer. And the film had to self-finance an insurance policy because, I guess they had to self-insure the movie because they didn't know if Julian would make it through the filming of the movie, but they really wanted to have him on there. But Julian Beck's performance as Kane was the most terrifying thing I can remember about being a child and watching those Poltergeist movies. He was something else.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. Well, the thing is, I mean, he was suffering from stage 4, I think, pancreatic cancer, and, just it's pretty terrible for him. But, I mean, he literally looked like death.
Yes.
And because he just had, the skin was kind of falling off his face, and I think he passed away a few months after filming, and he definitely was gone before the film came out.
Correct.
But, yeah, he gave a haunting performance in that film. And then also, at least, I didn't like the scene where Craig T. Nelson kind of vomited that
the beer
worm. Yeah, it was like a worm.
Well, the worm was in the beer, and he kept drinking it, and you're like, "Don't do it, don't do it!" And then it just goes down.
Because it was a possessed like worm, and then it's like he kind of vomited that big worm out, and I mean, it's just, again, as a kid, I did not enjoy that visual. So I mean, I guess maybe because Heather filmed it and she kind of saw how fake everything was, she just didn't think it was that scary, or maybe she at that age was a little more mature than me. It's funny because her line in Poltergeist 2, to me, is more iconic than her line in Poltergeist 1. In the first film, she says, "They're here." And in the second film, she says,
"We're back."
And it's just crazy because that line is used so much, like when you hear athletes talk about themselves, if they're returning to their team, and they're just like, "I'm back." And it's like, that it's from, I mean, they probably don't even realize in their psyche that it's from Poltergeist 2. And I just feel that that's just a reference that gets so lost. And one more thing, there's always been one line in Poltergeist 2 that kind of hits me in the stomach. In the beginning, when Heather is talking to her grandmother, and she just says a line, I don't want to grow up much. It just kind of hits you pretty hard. It's like, I think she's sitting there thinking about her future, and the grandmother's like, "Don't you want to grow up?" And she's like, "I don't know. Maybe don't want to grow up much." And it's ugh. It's just a real hard line to hear.
Poltergeist was finished in late 1985, and they rushed the post-production so that it could premiere in May of 1986. It did not do as well as number 1, but it also did spawn Poltergeist 3, which is going to come a few years later. And we're going to talk about Poltergeist 3 in just a little bit. But before we do that, I want to talk about her appearance on the new Leave It to Beaver. If you've been following this podcast, you'll know that the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast has brought together the cast of the new Leave It to Beaver. We've reunited everybody from that show in various interviews throughout our last 50 episodes or so. And everybody was able to talk about Heather because they all had interactions with her. So, Brian, before we start, is there a memory that you have of Heather being on these 2 episodes that is poignant for you?
Yeah, well, something that was really interesting with Heather is that she did a lot of guest starring roles, but usually when kids do guest starring roles, they play themselves. And, Heather really took on some fairly meaty roles in her guest starring. I mean, I think she played a blind girl in an episode of Matt Houston, and she kind of, for the new Leave It to Beaver, played a character very opposite of who she was. She's a very sweet, smart little girl, and she, at least for the first episode, her first appearance, she played this real snotty girl who is a new student to the school and then essentially is blackmailing Kelly.
Correct.
Into being her friend. So I mean, she really kind of was an unlikable character, which is surprising. It just shows how good of an actress this little girl was, because you watched that episode and you really did not like her.
You also could think that it was the character that she was on Webster, now just grown up, because she was a pretty snotty kid on Webster. This is Cindy Begel. She was one of the writers of the episode that Heather was on first. She was on 2 episodes of The New Leave to Beaver. Heather was a last-minute addition to replace another actor, and Cindy is going to tell us her memories of that casting decision.
I have a great story about Heather. There was an episode on The New Leave It to Beaver. I remember what happened was Brian Levant was usually always in casting, and he was directing and couldn't be there. And he asked my partner and I to cast a young girl. I think it was somebody who played a friend of Kelly's. And so we saw a whole lot of young girls, and there was one girl who was an absolute standout. And so we hired her, and we were really, really excited. So the set the next day, they actually read the lines that they're going to be reading. They're not reading something else. They're reading the actual lines. And she was very natural and wonderful. Well, what happened was the next day, or a day or two later, when Brian was directing her, she was horrible, terrible. And he said to us, why? He said, why would you cast this girl? I said, but she was really good. He goes, she's horrible. So overacting. And so we go and we talk to the girl's mother, and the mother said, I've been working with her. So the mother ruined the natural instincts of the girl. And so Brian said, I can't use her. And we need somebody really, really good, and we need somebody very fast, and we need somebody for tomorrow morning. And so he said maybe we could get Heather O'Rourke. So she lived in Big Bear, which was not anywhere near L.A., and she only had that night to come in prepared if she was available. And she was very young. And so she took the job. She showed up. I think the parents drove her from Big Bear, had a very big part, and made no mistakes and was wonderful. And we just never saw any young kid do that. I don't know how she did that. I don't know how she learned those lines that night. So she was wonderful. That girl was amazing. And it was tragic what happened to her. She was a real talent and a nice kid too.
You can tell the emotion that some people get when they start talking about the fact that she's not here anymore, that some actress, very young, had a very large impact on some very big people in the business.
Oh, I absolutely love that story. See, I love hearing stories like that where you kind of don't realize that someone gets replaced at the last minute or something. I mean, because that's a very common thing in Hollywood. I mean, like one of my favorite stories is Jennifer Love Hewitt was auditioning for a show called Kids Incorporated. That was like a singing kind of Mickey Mouse Club-ish type show. And she was it got down to her and one other girl, this big kind of casting, and it got down to her and this other person. And at the very last minute, they cast the other person. And Jennifer Love Hewitt was really upset. She got into her car and was with her mom, and they were about to head home until they got a phone call that the producers said that the other girl, I guess, could only perform that one song. There was one song she was using for her audition, and besides that one song, she couldn't do anything else.
Oh, no.
So she was replaced, and Jennifer got the role, and the rest was history. So, I mean, it's just one of those funny stories like this where this girl gets this role and does this amazing audition, and then the mom gets into her head and kind of totally screws it up. And then there came Heather to the rescue. I mean, that's a wonderful story. I'd never heard that before.
Well, here's another story you might not have heard before. We talked about that famous line, "We're back," and that came up. You often wonder if Heather goes to a set of another show, if they talk about her past success or maybe what she's known for. And we got a little sneak peek from actor John Snee. He played the son of Jerry Mathers, or the Beaver, and John worked with Heather on the episodes that she was on. And one of his first encounters with her was a little bit of teasing. And I'll let John tell you the story.
I remember Heather just as being this really sweet, bubbly person, and she was so nice. I remember distinctly. It was before she was on the show for the first time, I remember seeing the trailer when I was at the movies for Poltergeist 2. And you remember her key line from that, her catchphrase from the first one was, "They're here."
Mm-hmm.
And then in the trailer, in the preview to the second movie, the catchphrase was, "They're back." And so I was so excited when I heard that she was going to be on the show. And the first day that I met her, she came into the classroom where Kaleena and I were, and she sat down, and I looked at her and I said, "Are they back?" And she just looked at me and she said, "Shut up," and just laughed. And then we really hit it off from there. And I just remember, we hung out for a bit. I think she was only on for 2 episodes, so we didn't really spend a whole lot of time together. But I do distinctly remember spending some time with her, having conversations with her, and she was just always such a sweet person. And it was such a shock and so heartbreaking when we all learned that she had passed at such a young age. It was so hard for her family, I'm sure, and it was just heartbreaking.
Oh man, I mean, can you imagine how many times Heather heard in her life people coming up to her saying, "They're here" or "They're back"? I mean, it's one of those things where when someone gets a catchphrase like, "What you talking about, Willis?"
Right.
I mean, I could just imagine, I mean, her going to school, and it probably got so old so fast. And it's just one of those things where, of course, she gets on that set and John is sitting there like, "Are they back?" It's like, oh man, it's kind of like, oh, you're being Mr. Original over there, aren't you? Well, and as we see, I mean, Heather is just, it even follows suit with her character. I mean, she seems like such a strong-minded person that it's just kind of like anytime anyone said that, she just would probably roll her eyes and be like, thinking in her mind, like, "You're an idiot." Like, seriously, like, I mean, it's one of those things where it's just, I'm sure it was constantly said to her because that was such a catchphrase.
Kipp Marcus was another son of Jerry Mathers on the show. And although he was older, so he didn't have as many interactions with her, he did have this to say, and the end of what he says about her loss kind of really shakes you and lets you know how big her departure was from this world.
Outside of the fact that I thought she was one of the most adorable little girls like on the planet, and her untimely death rocked our set. Outside of that, my memory of her was just always that, I think we wanted her to be on the show whenever she could be on the show. She was absolutely precocious and precious, and obviously once Poltergeist, I mean, she was a legend. And again, the shock of her loss was it was madness. It was madness. But I didn't, remember that she was maybe 4 or 5 years younger than me. So she was a real baby for me. So like, the little kids, like, obviously, I mean, I mentored Johnny and stuff like that and Kaleena, but I didn't really spend much time with the littles. But again, another example of just a huge talent.
Definitely a talent that a lot of people spotted. The talent, the professionalism, and just how nice she was. Even when you are a child celebrity, I think, Brian, you might have some stories of kids who maybe weren't so kind because of their fame. And Heather just wasn't one of those people.
Well, really what jumps out to you about Heather is just that she was such a professional. Because, I mean, you have like a certain type of child actor who's kind of like a big personality, a kid with ADHD who just is Mr. Hyperactive, or like a Shirley Temple who's just all big smiles. And the thing with Heather, and the thing that we've heard, the more people we talk to, and they really paint this picture that she was very serious and took her job seriously, always knew her lines, always knew other people's lines too. And she really cared about what she was doing. And they use that word precocious quite a bit. And it's funny because that word precocious, I've always wondered, is that a negative word or a positive word?
No, I think it's positive. It's like that kind of sassy curiosity.
Yeah, I mean, I always think of it as positive, but then I always think to myself, like, if I ever called someone precocious, am I like insulting them? But it's like, because am I saying that? Is that kind of like a nice way of saying like sassy or rude? But it's no, not at all. It's more just that they're very mature. And I think what really threw everyone off about Heather is because she was so little. I mean, she was tiny, a little thing. I think she was maybe about 4 feet or like 4'5", and she just kind of, you look at her and she just got this, big maturity for somebody so little. And it just kind of threw everyone off, and in a good way. They're just kind of like, wow, it's like a little mini adult here.
Now, Janice Kent played the wife of Tony Dow, who is Kaleena Kiff's mom on the show, and this is what she remembers about Heather.
I do remember her. She was a very, very sweet little girl and very, very professional. Actually, both she and Kaleena were like two little pros because Kaleena had been on a big show in New York with Tony Randall. So she was very used to being...
Wasn't that Love, Sydney?
Love, Sydney she was on.
Correct.
And Heather, of course, had been in movies. So the only thing I can tell you, I didn't have too much to do with her because we, most of the scenes that she had were
with the kids.
With Kaleena, with the kids. But no, I just can only remember her as a very sweet and a very, very professional little girl. She knew her stuff.
During this time, with Heather, I mean, she was, as I was saying, nonstop. And after Poltergeist 2, she was guest starring, and she was doing a lot of TV specials. Like they had some We Are the World kind of special where they had, like, remember that song that a lot of the huge artists performed. They then had a kids version of that, and she was part of that group. And then she also performed on putting on the kids, I think, a Christmas special where she was lip singing to I think it was Jingle Bell Rock, and she was really just present everywhere. And I think I even heard that she auditioned for the role of Vicky in Small Wonder.
Yes,
I'm not
she did. Yes, where she's a robot.
Are you familiar with that terrible show?
Terrible. I own the seasons. I found somebody selling them like 5 years ago, and I was like, I have to have this. I like the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those ones that's so terrible that you like it. I mean, when I say terrible, I mean it's just kind of ridiculous. And I mean the actress Tiffany Brissett who played Vicky, I mean, did an amazing job playing that robot. But I mean, it was just kind of, I'm sure there are other roles that Heather auditioned for that she didn't get. But that one was one that, at least I would say, I'm kind of thankful she didn't get that, because I mean, that would have been a waste of her talent, in my opinion. And then it's nice to be able to see her in other roles that we saw.
The other person that shared a large portion of screen time with Heather O'Rourke is Kaleena Kiff. And thanks to you, Brian, Kaleena was on the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast sharing her memories of Heather, as well as expressing something that we talked about at the top of the show. Heather was one of the first people that we could relate to or felt like we knew that passed away. And Kaleena tells us about that.
Yeah, that was a relationship. I mean, she was the first person I ever knew to die. I guess I was maybe 11 when she died. That was so shocking. She came onto the show to be my nemesis, and this is, of course, post Poltergeist. So we were all very excited to have her. She was, wow, Heather O'Rourke. I found her very aloof, but very kind. She was like me in the seriousness department, so we got along very well. And a couple times outside of work, we baked cookies, or we would hang out with my guardian, her mother. So I tried to sort of welcome her into our little team of kids. We had so many guest stars cycling in and out. It was hard to keep in touch with everybody, but because she was a recurring character, I liked the idea that we could be friends as well. And unfortunately, that was cut very short. I don't believe that was meant to be the end of her time on the show, the last time she was on it. So, I had every expectation that we would continue to be friends, because we did have a lot in common.
Kaleena, was very much like Heather. I think that's why the two of them really got along well. And it's interesting how she says at the beginning she came across a little aloof. And I think if I was going to guess, I would say that probably because she was maybe a tad intimidating for some of these actors. All of a sudden you had a big, young movie star coming on the set. And as we heard in that first clip you played, that she wasn't originally supposed to be in that role. So all of a sudden she kind of walks on there and she's playing kind of this snooty girl whose script she got a day before.
Right.
So I think that, that probably contributed to why she was, I guess, getting into character. But Kaleena obviously bonded with her very much because they were both the same way. They were both very serious about their work, and it was great that they became friends.
I think people searching the internet have often come across a lot of rumors regarding Heather, and one of those rumors we went right to the cast about. We wanted to find out if this thing was real or not, and I know it's not a huge deal, but it kind of plays to the personality of Heather, and that would be a rumor that you brought to my attention of the cast messing up their lines on purpose and Heather getting frustrated by that. But they were doing it kind of to get a reaction from Heather.
Yeah, and the minute I heard that rumor, I didn't think it was true. It just kind of didn't seem like, being that I know Kaleena, that Kaleena would not have done that. And, of course, I just can't imagine any kid on a set purposely messing up takes to screw up another actor, because, I mean, most child actors know you don't mess things up for the adults because you're going to get in trouble.
But here's the deal. There are two conflicting stories that we got regarding this. So I want you to listen to both the take of Kaleena, what she thought about this rumor, and then there's John Snee. And I don't know if you heard his take on it, but after I play both of them, I want you to kind of tell me whose story you believe. Do you remember a prank like that happening?
Not at all. Not even a little. That sounds so far-fetched to me for a couple reasons. We didn't really prank a lot on set. Like, that just wasn't our way. Sometimes we would get the giggles and we couldn't control ourselves.
Yeah.
But most of the time, all of us, as much as we got into hijinks offset, we showed up to work. We got her done. And we had to do, sometimes 7 pages of dialogue, and it's all about us. So we knew that there wasn't time to mess about. So I don't think we would ever force a cut. And I also don't think that we were mean like that. I don't think we would play pranks. So I don't recall that, but maybe it's true. And if it did, I think that that's awful.
I know. I don't think you did.
That's terrible, but no, I don't think that happened.
All right. I was on her side, Brian, until John told the story. Just listen to how he tells it, and then you kind of tell me what you think.
Okay, I'll be open-minded here.
I don't remember too many specific examples. I remember one time where I had to, one of my lines included the words sheepskin seat covers, and I couldn't get it out.
Wow! Now we got enough for the go-kart, and maybe even enough for a sheepskin seat cover.
We must have done 15 or 20 takes.
Yeah.
Sheepskin seat covers. Try saying that fast 20 times. I don't remember her getting annoyed with me in particular. It wouldn't surprise me though. We did goof around quite a bit, and yeah, she was. I do remember her being pretty serious about acting. She took it pretty seriously.
At the end, he does admit that it's possible it happened.
I'm still going to say that I believe that it did not happen. I'm going to side with Kaleena. Maybe I'm being biased because I know her, but it kind of didn't seem to me that John really remembered specifically. And also on the show, Kaleena had more lines with her than I can't even remember a scene that John actually had with her where they were talking and everything. So, I mean, I'm going to still say that this did not happen.
Okay. We'll put this one to bed finally.
Yeah.
Anything else about the new Leave to Beaver before we move on to Poltergeist 3?
No, but I think it's important we talk about 1987, like kind of that year. This is probably the year that there's the most discrepancy online when it comes to Heather's timeline. And that's kind of where we're entering here, because she did the new Leave It to Beaver at the end of 86, and then 1987 starts. So 1987 starts, and MGM greenlights a third Poltergeist film. Now, over here on this third Poltergeist film, it's going to be really Heather doing the show, because Craig T. Nelson's not going to return, Jo Beth Williams is not going to return, and Oliver Robbins is not going to return. So the only returning cast members are going to be Heather and Zelda Rubinstein. And so they're going to take this to Chicago and kind of give it its own little story where she's going to live with I think it's her aunt and uncle that she's going to live with. And this is really an opportunity right now. For the first time, Heather is going to be carrying a film. And she was very excited about this. And so in 1987 is the first time that Heather starts experiencing some health problems. And, at the beginning of the year, they're going to be filming, I believe, in the summer of 1987. And so Heather, at least she's got some stomach problems, and she kind of is telling her mom, and they take her to the doctor, and she thinks that maybe she drank some bad well water or something when they were camping, and maybe she had a parasite. And they weren't totally sure what was wrong with her, and they did a ton of tests, and it kind of came back that she had Crohn's disease. That was kind of the diagnosis based on the x-rays and everything. And so they decided they were to treat that. You give some medication, and the doctor there gave Kathy a doctor to go to in Chicago when they film over there. And, you know, Kathy was taking great care of Heather. I mean, anytime anything was wrong, took her to the doctor, made sure everything was fine. And so they gave her this medication. They kind of said, like, you know, here, we're going to give her this medication. And if it starts working well, then this doctor in Chicago will give you more, and we'll see how this works. And if it starts working and she responds well to it, we can kind of wean her off the medication, and we can kind of go from there. And so Kathy's like, yeah, sure, let's do it. Everything sounds fine. So, you know, so they get on a plane and they head to Chicago to film Poltergeist 3. And she's taking this medication that, unfortunately, one of the side effects, it kind of puffs up her cheeks a little bit, kind of gives it like a steroid or a cortisone. And that's why in parts of the film, when you watch Poltergeist 3, she kind of looks like she's got some kind of puffy cheeks, like these kind of chipmunk cheeks, like she just had her wisdom teeth out. I don't know if you had your wisdom teeth out, but when I did it, that's pretty much what my face looked like.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is, she was responding pretty well to this medication. And I guess just, you know, based on the diagnosis, it looked like that was kind of what she had, at least according to the doctors. And she was responding well. And so they decided to kind of, you know, wean her off the medication. And that's why kind of if you see different parts of the film, she looks a little more normal, just you know, back to her normal self, what she looked like then. And so everything seemed to be kind of okay. She was seeing doctors. And of course, you know, one more rumor to address was Poltergeist 3 finished shooting when she passed away?
All right, I can tell you the answer to that.
Yeah, the answer to that is not really. That's always kind of the weird little thing there, because of the fact that it should have been done, but at least like from what I've heard is that they were planning to finish everything, but when it got time to shoot the ending, they realized that they did not have everything in play. Like all the stuff that they made just didn't look up to par.
Well, I want to jump in here because we haven't aired the episode yet, but Gary Sherman is on Fancounters in January. And he does tell the story because I asked him, I said, usually films film out of order. And if you had everything filmed from Poltergeist except the ending, I said a lot of films even start with the ending first. You know, was it made that way purposely so that the ending was shot last? And he said,
the original ending that I wrote for the film, the studio had determined before we started shooting the film that it was too expensive. And they asked me to do an alternate ending when we originally shot the film. And we came up with an idea for an alternate ending that none of us were very happy with. Jay and Letty just said to me, shoot the alternate ending. If we don't like it, we'll come back and shoot your ending, you know, and we'll put the money into it and shoot the full ending. We shot the film, and I mean, I don't remember when the ending was shot. It was not shot last. It was shot sometime in the schedule.
Okay.
And we put the film together with this ersatz ending that was done, and we previewed it. And the audiences hated it as much as I did. So anyways, we went back and we talked about it, and the boys said, yeah, okay, get it done.
Yeah, you know, he did such a great job in filming the film, and I think that this was his baby, and, you know, he wanted to have a big punch at the end, a great ending. And I think that, as a filmmaker, we're going to fight for the creative endings and different parts of the film, and he was fighting for this. And just unfortunately, like this, they didn't really factor this into the equation, because who would?
And I didn't want to interrupt you before, Brian, but I did want to mention, I am strongly on the side of Kathleen. in the decisions that she made with all of the doctor visits. And I want to make it clear, before they left for Poltergeist 3, it's a fact. They went to the doctor and they had x-rays taken of Heather's stomach and intestines, because part of that Crohn's disease diagnosis is the inflammation of the small intestine. So they were watching that. How they could not see the blockage that was already occurring and was happening there before they left for filming floors me.
Yeah, I mean, totally. I mean, it's just one of those things where, I mean, obviously, medical malpractice and misdiagnoses are really hard to litigate. They just usually are. But it's like a thing where, yeah, you wonder, you had the x-ray there. How can you not see it? And it's just one of those things where, I mean, it baffles me. I mean, I know that what happened with Heather was an anomaly. I mean, it was a very rare condition that a lot of doctors are just not looking for. And I guess just in general, I mean, hopefully her passing has spurred doctors to look for this condition, and hopefully her situation has saved other lives.
Well, as you know, and we talked about, Gary Sherman was the director of Poltergeist 3, and in an unaired interview, which is coming up next month, you can hear it on Fancounters, he talks about Heather, and I'm going to play this, which is his favorite Heather O'Rourke memory.
I just absolutely adored Heather O'Rourke. I mean, if I could have adopted her, I would have. My girlfriend, during the time that I was doing Poltergeist, she and I just loved Heather. We used to take her places. We would borrow her from her parents on weekends and take her places. It was her birthday at one point, and we asked if we could take her out to dinner, and so the two of us just took Heather to dinner at some place that she said she wanted to go. And we just used to have the best time with her. And I'll tell you the best Heather story. We had an explosion on the set, in the garage sequence.
Yeah.
When Tom lights the gasoline and it blows up the car. Well, anyhow, we had a big problem with that scene, and we were supposed to have the Chicago Fire Department there, but we were shooting the scene out in Oak Brook Terrace, and the mayor of Oak Brook Terrace said, "I don't want you to bring the Chicago Fire Department in. Our fire department can handle this." And we said, "We don't think so." And he says, yeah, we can do this. So we had brought one person out to train them, and it seemed like it was going to be okay. Well, when the explosion actually happened, these guys got so scared they dropped their hoses and ran. And when I gave the cue for them to put the fire out,
they weren't there.
And I'm watching over a television camera. There's no firemen, and suddenly they come running out of all the entrances to the garage. We're all outside. It was too dangerous to have anybody inside other than the firemen and a couple of special effects guys. Anyhow, suddenly there's black smoke pouring out from everything. We can't see anything on the video cameras. And the whole place is burning. There's flames and black smoke pouring out of the garage. So our special effects guys grabbed the hoses and ran in there and grabbed breathing apparatus, and they put out the fire. But the fire had just gone. I mean, they put out the fire enough so they could get the cameras out. We got all the cameras out.
Thank goodness.
I mean, we had 3 Panavision cameras down there. So there's, $1.5 million worth of cameras.
Wow.
And lenses down there sitting in their fireproof plastic boxes, but who knows how long those boxes would have stayed fireproof.
Right.
Exactly.
So they went down and got the cameras, and our Ben Scott, our stunt coordinator, and Callie Cord, our special effects guy, and their guys, they were just total heroes. They went down, they made sure that there was no one left down there, that no one had been left behind, which the firemen, when they ran, left people behind. And we got everybody out of there. And anyway, the news was there because the fire burned and did a couple of $1 million worth of damage to the building.
Oh, my gosh.
To do. And so anyways, it was all over the news that night. And so the next morning, I'm sitting in my office, and Heather comes running into my office and says, Gary, I saw it in the news last night about the fire and the explosion. I said, yeah, it was really horrible. She said, did anyone get hurt? And I said, no one got hurt. She said, oh, that's good. And she looks at me and says, did you get the shot?
That's a professional, a very young professional.
I mean, that was Heather, man. She was the best. She wanted to be a director. Her real career choice was going to be to become a director. She didn't want to stay an actor. She was going to act as long as she needed to make money, and then go off to school and study and become a director. And I think she would have been a great director. She was incredibly smart. She was, for 11 years old, she was just so sophisticated and so thoughtful. And she was great. I mean, she used to sit on the set with me all the time and watch me set up these shots. And she would ask me really intelligent questions about what I was doing. And she kept saying to me, you don't mind me being here, do you? I said, no, you just go, because I never sit in my chair. I said, just go sit in my chair. And she was just great. I actually have some pictures of her. She'd come down and watch dailies with me. And she was incredible. She was just the best.
Definitely showing some love for Heather. Really thought of her like a daughter. And I can only imagine that if she would have continued to pursue her directorial pursuits, that he would have been right along there with her.
Oh, yeah, no, of course. And it's always great to hear her personality and how after this big, almost near tragedy happened on the set, her thing was like, is everyone okay? And then, oh, by the way, did you get the shot?
Was the most, yeah.
As a filmmaker, I would have just been like, oh my God, I love this kid. I mean, that was that's just how she was, though.
Yeah.
And at least when I've spoken with other people who worked on the Poltergeist 3 crew, they all say the same thing, that she was just this little tiny thing, because they just kind of, I guess when you look so much younger than you are, and then you're just as mature as she was, you just love her, because she really cares about what she's doing, and she was always interested in what everyone else was doing. Very curious.
There are some behind-the-scenes moments of that film that Kathleen had shot with her personal camcorder, film that I've been able to see and you have been able to see, and it just shows how interested she was and how patient she was. Like when her double was pulling her up that mirror, there must have been a good 20 minutes of footage from them trying to get that shot. And she never once said, this is hurting, or I'm uncomfortable, or is this almost over? She was all about making sure that project looked as perfect as it could. And I think in her mind, she was probably told this is your moment to really show that you're a leading movie star. So maybe that played into it a little bit, but it was also her natural passion for making a film project.
But she loved filmmaking, and she just loved kind of learning about the different aspects, and never wanted to complain or to make any waves, because she just knew that her complaining or doing something is going to slow up the process. And that's a testament to her character.
Another clip that I have from Gary, I asked him, I said, we're going to do this special on her birthday in remembrance of her. Do you have one final thing that you might be able to share that you've never shared before? And there was a long moment of silence, and he had a hard time coming up with one specific thing, but he did say this.
God, I mean, just working with Heather every day was just a joy. She was just so smart. I mean, from day one, when we sat down to do a table read, and her relationship with Zelda off screen was as endearing as their relationship was on screen. They just absolutely adored each other. And I think, the things that I remember most about Heather is from day one, she said to me, she said, I want to spend a lot of time on the set with you because I like the way you direct. And I mean, this coming out of an 11-year-old
yeah.
was just mind-boggling. But, she was a 45-year-old back then in an 11-year-old body. She was so smart. She was so aware. She was so caring. She was so loving. She was just this wonderful human being. wrapped up in this adorable 11-year-old body. And she was very special, and I miss her. And I think we all miss her.
Absolutely.
Because I think she would have gone on to become something very, very, very special.
What do you think when you hear him talk about that?
No, I mean, it's wonderful to hear that. It's just, and it all follows suit. I mean, like, you really kind of hear how she had such an impact on people. And I'm sure you even know this. I mean, there have been times in your life where, I mean, we see tons of kids all the time, all our friends who have kids, and I'm sure even your kids' friends. And then every once in a while, you'll come across a kid who is just really mature. And like, just it just sticks out to you. Like, I mean, there's a time a few years ago, one of my friends, his son was 10 years old and was a major sports nut. And I was talking to him, and we talked for like an hour, because like just hearing the knowledge that he had, and I can have like debates with him about sports, and it just really jumped out at you, the maturity of, like, to me, this kid. And that's kind of how Heather was, because most people with child actors, when you're dealing with them, most of them, they're just kids. But then when there's that one that comes about who just has a certain maturity to them, you just remember. And that's what we're seeing with Heather, of who she was, that she just was this. I'm sure she had her moments of being a kid, because anyone is. But overall, you know, she cared about what she did, the way she spoke. I mean, as you saw what she said to Gary, kind of like, I want to work with you again. As like an 11-year-old, like, I want to see, like, basically, when I direct films, I want you by my side.
Yeah.
And just, it's one of those things where it's just, I love hearing interviews and finding out about her personality, because it sounds like she had a big one.
Poltergeist 2 is not the last time Oliver Robbins got to see Heather. In this next clip that I want to play from you from Oliver, he talks about one of the moments that he remembers most with her after those movies were filmed.
She actually hung out at my house. She came to visit me at my house. And then I also saw her on the set of Happy Days. She invited me down, and I saw her on the set, and I met Henry Winkler, who I actually went to school with his stepson years later. And he was such a nice man. And she was so sweet, and she hadn't changed at all. And she was so, even as becoming a young teenager at that point, she was, she really had her head on her shoulders, and she seemed very down to earth, and she hadn't changed at all since I worked with her on Poltergeist.
Well, before we move on from Poltergeist 3, I do have one little nugget to share.
Okay.
I actually was talking to somebody who worked as the assistant costume designer on Poltergeist 3, and she had a fun little Heather story to share.
Cool.
Yeah, and I'll just read it exactly what it says here. It says, I worked as an assistant costume designer and constructed one of the clothes for Poltergeist 3. And during fittings, Heather told me that she had learned to sew to make her own clothes because she was so small for her age. At some point, she came to me and asked if she can come over to my studio at Grand in Horn to sew up some things on her day off. So we set up a little table for her, just her size, and she happily sewed for most of the day while we worked on other clothes for the movie.
Oh my gosh.
I made those little red one-piece pajamas that she wore.
Wow.
So she just was talking about how cool it was that Heather seemed to have an interest in sewing. And at least what I've heard is that she used to make a lot of her own dolls, and she loved making clothes. And I guess, we talked about earlier that Kathy was a seamstress. So
yes.
It appears that Kathy kind of taught her how to sew and construct things. And it was just really cool that she remembers this about Heather and thought it was just so amazing that she wanted to partake in her clothes making.
That's very cool. Thanks for sharing that. That's a neat tidbit.
The fun thing is also to talk about another unknown period of time was after Poltergeist 3 was filmed. So, they wrap in the summer of 1987. And so for that fall of 87, Heather, for the first time in a long time, went back to school and could enjoy just being a full-time student.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, so she's now in the 7th grade, and she just started middle school at a school called Tierra del Sol in Lakeside, which is kind of like near San Diego. It's kind of where her family lived at that point. And during this time, I think Heather really enjoyed this because she knew that they were going to resume filming Poltergeist 3 at the beginning of 1988, so she kind of had some time. And I'm sure she kind of drove up a few times for some auditions in Los Angeles, but for the most part, she got to be a regular kid for the first time in a long time. And she was very smart, and she was a great reader and did well and got good grades. And at least from what I've heard from a couple of classmates that we've spoken to, or that I've spoken to throughout the years, that she was just very, she was very easy to talk to. She had no problem talking about her movie history, but also, acted like had no attitude or wasn't conceited or cocky. And they had like a Christmas play at school, and I think she was the lead. I think that this was a period that she really enjoyed. And then from what I've heard, that the school, obviously everyone was beyond devastated when she passed away in the beginning of 1988. But they have an award that I believe still exists at the school. It's called like the Heather O'Rourke Book
Reading
Award.
Award, yeah.
Yeah, Reading Award. So it's nice that the school still pays tribute to her that way. She did get to attend middle school, so it was nice to kind of be able to get into see how she was as a person, and that's what's kind of a fun. This period of time is one that's not talked about too much. It's this fall of '87.
Yeah, and just before that school year happened, after Poltergeist had wrapped for the time being, they took off with Jim in his semi. They went on a tour of the United States, basically. They drove down from Chicago to Florida. They went to Disney World, and then they drove the southern portion of the United States all the way back to Los Angeles. So that was probably a really fun time where you didn't have to worry about working. You just had to worry about hanging out with your mom and your stepdad and had fun. And I don't think Tammy was on that journey. I'm not sure where she was or what she was doing at that time, but we do know that when they got back, when the calendar turned to 1988, that's when, the sadness starts, and that's where this story is going to pick up.
Yeah, so 1988 was looking like it was going to be a pretty good year. Just everything was looking wonderful. They had a great Christmas vacation. Heather just celebrated her 12th birthday, and she was looking at 1988 as the year that they were going to kind of finish Poltergeist 3. Film was going to come out during the summer. She was really excited to see the final product. And then she was going to be turning 13 later that year. So everything was looking great.
And it all did look really good until we get to Super Bowl weekend. And that was that first, end part of January into February 1st. On January 29th, 1988, Heather mentioned to Tammy that she didn't feel like attending gym class that day, but she didn't say why. In fact, we've heard over several interviews, Brian, that Heather really never complained about feeling sick at any time. In fact, Tammy, when she talked to me during my Fancounters interview with her, also mentioned that she was not one to complain about anything. And I think that has shown through her filming and now through her health. So on that Saturday, she stayed home most of the day, but she did go to eat at Wendy's, and that was where Tammy was working. And I want to fill in the story just a little bit because this is Tammy Walker, Heather's sister, talking about the last time she saw her sister Heather.
Yeah, I was actually working at Wendy's, the fast food place, and she actually came in to see me the night before for dinner. And then I was going to a friend's house to spend the night, and she went back to her place. And so I don't know what was going on the evening of it happening. I just know that the next morning she had I got a phone call from her mother saying that Heather had passed out. She got up to walk around. She passed out on the floor. And the ambulance was called, and they took her to the hospital. So I didn't see anything until I got to the actual hospital. So I missed those moments of when from the night I last saw her to after that. Mm-hmm. The last time I saw her, talk to her was when she came to see me at work.
What were those final moments like? I mean, you were at work, so that had to be hard. It's not like you. Yeah,
it was. I remember, like, to this moment now talking, I can remember seeing her sitting at the table, like, across the way, like, in the dining area, and I was, like, a cashier. And, I'd go out, take a little break and sit with them while they ate dinner a little bit, and we just kind of joked around and stuff. And then she's like, oh, okay, I'm going to go back, and, then it's time to go back and get ready for the football game, and, that kind of thing, and stuff. So that was really, what the whole day was. There was no, like, harsh words to each other or nothing. And, it was like, okay, I'll see you later. And, and off she went.
Yeah, well, that's the whole thing. I mean, everything seemed fine with Heather health-wise really up until this point. So she was on the medication, and it just seemed that everything was okay. So there was no reason to take her to any doctors at this point, and it really wasn't until this weekend. But her symptoms really seemed like at this point they were flu-like.
Yeah, in fact, Sunday morning, Kathleen and Jim were awakened to the sound of Heather being sick. So she came into bed with them for a few hours. And she spent the rest of the day basically on the couch. Her mom was checking on her. Her symptoms were very flu-like, so she kept giving her fluids, Kathleen had sought advice from a phone consult from a nurse to make sure that she was kind of doing the right thing. And then it was that tragic day on Monday, February 1st, 1988, when Heather woke up for school just as usual, thought she was going to have a pretty normal day, but she had trouble getting some toast down. And I'm going to let Kathleen pick up the rest of the story.
We know she was breathing real heavy. And I got to the phone, I just called any number that was nearby, and I says, I got a little girl here that her fingers are blue, and she's breathing heavily. I said, bring her right in. So I said, Heather, go get your clothes on, I'll get mine on. And in a matter of, I guess, probably 30 seconds, she hollered, oh, Mom, and she'd fallen on the floor. And she was coherent and talking, but she was kind of, her face was kind of turned, and kind of listless, that kind of a look. And my husband called the paramedics. And they came and said she needed oxygen, and she says, I don't need no oxygen, I'm fine. They said, yes, we need to put the oxygen on you. And they said, you feeling bad? She said, just a little. And then they prepared her and got her on the gurney and went out the door, and then outside the door she threw up, and I wiped her mouth. She said, I'm sorry, Mom, And they took her to the ambulance, and she suffered cardiac arrest.
Yeah, I mean, as we see, this happened very quickly that morning. And, of course, the thing that jumps out to me there is the fact that Heather is saying, I'm sorry to her mom after throwing up. I mean, it just kind of shows you her character, too. I mean, she's sitting here literally dying, and she's apologizing.
Yeah.
I mean, it just kind of breaks your heart. And just, hearing Kathy talk about it, of course, is really hard.
Paramedics did try to attempt to revive her, but the cardiac arrest had already occurred. Once at the hospital, they did succeed in restoring her vital signs, but it was at that point where they thought that maybe she was brain dead and that it was too much for her little body to take. They did end up stabilizing her, and she was transported by life flight helicopter to another hospital who was more, in fact, Children's Hospital in San Diego, who was more used to taking care of these kind of trauma situations. And although she remained unconscious and unresponsive, they prepped her for surgery anyway. Kathleen and Jim were then informed that she may have already suffered the brain damage that I just spoke about due to the episode of the cardiorespiratory arrest in the ambulance. Kathleen then gave permission to perform the exploratory procedure. Heather did have an obstruction in her small intestine. It had become infected, and by the time they found it, it had already burst. So when this occurred, the infectious contents spilled into Heather's abdomen, bacteria entered her bloodstream, and they rapidly multiplied and spread throughout her body. That infection and buildup of bacterial toxins eventually caused septic shock, which is what we've heard many times the actual cause of death being, and the situation was very life-threatening. They did the emergency surgery to remove the obstruction and tried to repair Heather's small intestine, which was a pretty common procedure. It had a high rate of success and recovery and was routinely performed on pediatric patients at this particular children's hospital. So that's why Heather's mom agreed to it. But because of that overwhelming bacterial infection, the septic shock, and also the brain damage that she had suffered, Heather's condition was definitely very uncertain, was not looking good even before that surgery was attempted. They did end up completing the operation, and the intensive care resumed, but Heather had showed no sign of improvement. She, in fact, never regained consciousness, and it was feared that her brain showed no activity. She remained alive, but shortly after 2 o'clock, her condition began to worsen, and soon after, her heartbeat faltered and her breathing stopped. For more than a half an hour, doctors tried desperately to resuscitate her, but all hope was lost, and Heather died peacefully at 2:43 p.m. on Monday, February 1st, 1988, at the age of 12. It's very hard to read that. It's very hard to get through that.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's also, hard because there's so much medical mumbo jumbo. But I mean, the bottom line of what happened was that she had that obstruction in her bowel, and it bursts. And when that happens, kind of like all that contents go into your bloodstream, and that's what septic shock is. It sounds like just a weird phrase, septic shock, but that's essentially what happened. The reason why this was so unusual, what happened to Heather, is because the type of obstruction that she had and the birth defect usually is detected in somebody who's about 2 or 3 years old, because it's something that's typically really painful to be able to have at that time. And that's why it was just very unusual for someone at her age to have that. The fact that she survived or went through all those years with no pain was so highly unusual. So that's why it wasn't on the doctor's radar at the time.
The other odd thing about the timing of all of this happening is something that I talked about in that podcast with Tammy. In Poltergeist 1, Brian, do you remember, and I know you've heard my show with Tammy already, but there's that Super Bowl poster hanging in the kids' room. And it is for the 1988 Super Bowl, which is such a weird coincidence. And I even tried to track down the art department of those who created that poster. And I was basically told through email from the set decorators that they were, because the budget of that film was not as grand, an item like that would not have been created for the film. So then they were picking things from the various buildings at MGM to put things in the bedroom that just happened to be maybe created for something else, and they threw it in there and used it. I don't think anybody really understood how creepy that coincidence would be until the day that we just talked about.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those weird coincidences, but I think it's nothing more than a coincidence.
It was just a coincidence. I'm convinced of that, especially after hearing from the art department directly.
Yeah, so she passed away on Monday, February 1st, and just to give people a little bit of a timeline, they had two funerals. There was one funeral that was on that Thursday, and that was a local funeral in Lakeside where they lived, which was near San Diego, and that was reserved for her friends and kind of people who lived close by. And then the next day, which was Friday, they had her other funeral, which was where she was transported to Los Angeles and laid to rest in Westwood, California, which is near UCLA. And that was more for industry people to attend or anybody who lived in Los Angeles. And that's where she resides today. And one thing that was kind of interesting that I'll share is that it's just kind of a little nugget tidbit is, I guess, and MGM was very kind in the fact that they paid for her funeral and her plot, and which was incredibly kind of them to do. This is probably why she was laid to rest in Los Angeles when she lived in San Diego. But one thing that was kind of interesting, I guess, like just with the business aspect of trying to see how they can pay for it and how they can kind of write it off, is that they, I guess, for the books, they made it so it was going to be part of the Poltergeist 3 budget or publicity budget. So the way to kind of get through that is they had to make sure that they said Poltergeist 3 on her plaque. So that was kind of the one little way they were able to kind of get that in there to be able to expense it. So that's why on her plaque it says Carol Ann and Poltergeist 1, 2, and 3. Even though it's appropriate. I mean, it's appropriate to say that, but it's just kind of an interesting fact of the fact that they kind of had to put that in there.
Wow. That's something I didn't know.
Yeah, not many people would know that. I mean, it doesn't take away from the kindness that they did. I mean, it was actually very nice. It was just more that was the way that they kind of had to kind of, for the book's purposes, make it seem like it was more of an advertisement. But it definitely makes sense, and it's appropriate, and it should be there. But it's just kind of, I just find those things interesting.
Well, that kind of brings us to almost a close. I know you've got one other treat you've been teasing me this whole time that you wanted to share. Do you want to share it now?
Yeah, no, definitely. It still has not been totally confirmed if Steven Spielberg attended her funeral. I don't think he did. I think he may have been out of town or something. But at least what I have here is a letter that Steven wrote. And I believe he sent this to the O'Rourke family. And it was a letter kind of made out to Heather. It's dated February 4th, 1988. And I'll just kind of shows you the emotions that he was feeling at that time. And I'll just read it. It says, "Dear Heather, I can hardly believe that now you've gone to that place we imagined together almost 7 years ago. Not that bad place with the scary trees, dopey monsters, and silly rubber closets, and our poltergeist fun, but to that bright light where all of us return someday, as old people, sometimes even as children. People have many ideas about what happens then, and there are religious and different personal beliefs. When I selected you that day in the MGM commissary to be the most important star of our movie, I saw in you someone very gifted. You will always be that gifted young girl to anyone lucky enough to have shared in your smile and your open trust. Maybe someday you will come back here as another little girl and live a very, very long and enchanting life, a storybook life. You had so much to give all of us. I will not believe that God borrowed you from your parents and sister and friends without some greater purpose that is beyond any mortal person's natural comprehension. And even though we had so little contact, you and me, over the past few years, I feel I know you and have always been there for you. I so hope you can feel all the love that is coming your way from hundreds of thousands of people all across the country and all around this world. We love you so very much and will miss you forever. Stephen.
That gives me chills as you read that. But through this process of talking about this movie and doing this podcast and pulling these clips and going through all these stories, I've gotten chills so many times. I can't even count them anymore.
Yeah, it just kind of shows you how much Heather meant to Stephen, and he was just kind of pouring his heart out there. And it kind of just seems like I think that he wrote that and sent it to Heather's family. So I think that pretty much sums up his feelings about her, and I think he speaks for all of us.
I think that's a good point to end on. Brian, thank you so much for joining me for this special episode to celebrate Heather's birthday. We delayed our podcast release a couple days because we just wanted to make it a very special point that this is a child that's greatly missed in her adult life, and very pleased to have you along on this journey as well.
Oh, it's an honor to be here, and I'm just happy to be here to celebrate the life of Heather. I mean, it's wonderful, this whole journey that, the two of us are continuing to go on as we kind of start giving Heather a voice and learning more about her as we go forward. And I think it's wonderful to be able to do this. And it just, melts my heart to do this for her, because as we've talked about, she was someone who was important to us. I think of her as kind of somebody I grew up with and one of my friends. So it's just great to be able to pay respect to her.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Fancounters Celebrity Podcast. Join us again next week as we continue in 2021 with a brand new celebrity guest talking about their career and highlighting some of the moments in their life that they will never forget. And Brian, thanks again, and we will talk to you all again next week.
Happy New Year.